And welcome everyone to another Smart Money Circle episode. I'm Adam Sarhan. With me today is Andrew Simpson, who's the CEO of Hard Sciences, ticker symbol is HSCS. Andrew, thank you so much for taking the time and welcome to the Smart Money Circle.
Thanks, Adam. I really appreciate the invite.
So, Andrew, I always like to begin. Can you please tell us your story and how you got to where you are today?
Yeah, and I'll try and do this succinctly. And I will start from quite a young age, actually, because I think it's part of the kind of, experience of where you get to. So when I was at school, I didn't amount to very much, just really because I kind of hang around with guys and was focused on, uh, you know, doing all sorts of stuff, playing sports, and didn't really think of myself as very academic. Um, and I wanted to be a professional golfer. I left school at 16 and thought, I'm going to be a professional golfer. That's going to be me. And very quickly, I realized that that was not going to be life on the PGA Tour. That was going to be life selling tee pegs and balls to members, which I figured was not the right way forward. So I got some very good advice, which was go and get yourself a degree um, from somebody pretty smart. And I did that. And because I'd spent a period of time, out and then working before I went to do my degree, it meant when I got there, I actually focused on what I was doing. And I did pretty well once, in my degree, which led me on to being able to work on for a CPA firm on Wall Street for a period of time when I was very young, which led me into getting a job at Price Waterhouse, which the school I went to, probably shouldn't have done. And I always remember that the guy who recruited me at Price Waterhouse, one of the big CPA firms, said to me, "You're my risk candidate. You're my risk candidate, Andrew," because I'd not come from one of the kind of top brass schools. Um, and lo and behold, I discovered actually all these people, a lot of people from these top places, actually their parents were wealthy. They sent them to the right schools, which means they got the right results, which means they went into the right background. And it taught me actually, you know, do what you believe in, do what you feels right, and actually make progress. So I worked at Price Waterhouse, qualified as a chartered accountant in the UK, then went to be an investment banker with Rothschild in Europe, where I was advising on, M&A and fundraising, did a lot in mid and smaller cap companies. So really, from a fairly young age, got a good understanding of business, and those backgrounds taught me about um, business really. And for example, when I was training at Price Waterhouse, I remember everybody saying, "This is boring. We're auditing bank and cash," and I was like, "Well, I've got the right to go and speak to anybody in this organization." So I'd go and speak to the sales director, uh, just understand what they were doing. So I found it quite interesting. Anyway, um, lo and behold, worked for Rothschild for a period, so got kind of a background in finance, and then went to run a couple of larger companies who've both been clients of mine at Rothschild's, which taught me about business and running businesses. One was became a FTSE 250 company in the UK, where I was running one of their divisions and undertook multiple acquisitions for them, and really added up, learned that building companies, one and one or two and two can sometimes equal six if you do the right things in business, adding the right organizations together. And then went to a much larger organization in the UK where I was CEO. So anyway, I kind of finished all of that kind of finance, big company background when I was in my early 40s, believed that I was a genius, because you do when you come from that kind of background. Quickly learned that I wasn't a genius, um, and started doing some things for myself, and learned that actually, the support of big organizations, and also when you're involved in big organizations, you only really deal with reputable people. That once you're out of that environment, actually, there's a lot of sharks, cheats, people who want to swindle you, all of that kind of stuff, and learned that the hard way. But I'd always had a real kind of interest in science, technology, all of those kind of things, intellectual um, interest. And I'd invested in Heart Sciences, at a relatively early stage, and quickly found that actually what was going on wasn't going to succeed. And me and, what became a business partner, who's now our COO, Mark Hills, we both put a lot of money into the company to take what was a concept and to move it to some level of commercial reality. So that's kind of how I got to where I was, which was a blend of, big companies, understanding that actually you've got to follow what you believe is right, learning from the school of hard knocks, and then becoming CEO at Heart Sciences, when it was just two of us really, and having to self-fund that for a long period of time.
Love it. What a great story. So let's talk about the company. Please let us know what you do and some of your competitive advantages.
Yeah. So Heart Sciences is really quite straightforward. We're about transforming screening for heart disease and the early detection of heart disease. So everybody out there will have heard of an ECG, which is also in the US known as an EKG, which is the test that produces a squiggly trace that everybody associates with the heart. Well, that test misses most forms of heart disease, but we've been applying artificial intelligence to the electrical signal of the heart, the ECG, and that yields a lot more data from that signal, which means that you can now detect a much broader, in fact, extremely broad range of heart disease and do it much earlier. So what that enables you to do then is you suddenly have a low cost, easy to perform test, doesn't require a specialist, can be performed in any environment. You suddenly have the opportunity to have a broad screening tool for heart disease. And heart disease is the biggest killer of people in the world and the biggest spend in all of healthcare. Today, despite the limitations, there's more than 100 million ECG tests undertaken in the US alone, estimates of 1 billion a year. So you're talking about what's a massive, massive issue, and we're about solving that. And in terms of competitive advantage, this, for a long time, this was a science project. We were the very first people that said doing more with an ECG was possible. And I used to get told, that's ridiculous. You'll never be able to do that by cardiologists. And after all, I don't have a cardiology background. But to me, and it was obvious that if you've got a signal that's being used as an analog waveform and you actually use modern science associated with it, then you take frequency information, energy information, etc., you can actually get more information out of that signal. So the field has transformed from being really a science project, which we were the early pioneer in, to now is being absolutely indisputable. There's an FDA setting a pathway for what's called AI ECG. The American Medical Association's already granted reimbursement codes, and actually Medicare is now reimbursing this. So from our perspective, we are the only company in the world that's building a holistic solution across the piece in ECG to upgrade the entire ECG industry, which is literally archaic. So we've built a device which has an embedded algorithm. So you could use that in any frontline environment really straightforwardly. We've built a software cloud-based solution to deliver algorithms, to large hospital groups where you've got more sophisticated IT. And we've been building a cloud native 21st century delivery platform for all of that, really with the view that we can upgrade across the industry, which we'll be the only people that can do and enable us to be the only people that can deliver AI ECG solutions from across all of healthcare, from a big sophisticated healthcare institution through to a mobile nurse practitioner who's doing mobile screening.
Got it. No, that makes perfect sense. So let's talk about risk management. How do you handle risk, and what are some mistakes you see people make with respect to risk management?
Yeah, well, I'll start with mistakes. I think the biggest mistake is people see risk management as being a checkbox exercise. What do you do if you lose? You've got a set of scenarios. You loss of a key executive, or business disruption event, or you've been hacked, and it's very much a checkbox exercise about putting solutions to what are actually known issues. And to me, that's the kind of one of those board-based approaches, but doesn't actually focus on the realities of day-to-day, dealing with the real risks that take place within an organization. So I think the thing that I would say is, first of all, you have to accept that there's always risk. I mean, going out of your house and crossing a road, there's a risk. You could be knocked over. I mean, there is a risk. So, how do you mitigate that risk? You're practical and sensible. You stand on this curb and you look both ways and you listen, and then you start to cross the road. But equally, you can't be a kind of stand in the mud. If out of the blue a car suddenly approaches, you have to run in the opposite direction. So, I think that you've got to accept that there's risk, be practical about it, and be pragmatic about making changes if that's necessary. The second thing I would say is, I think you've got to scale your risks. There are certain risks in life that are, irrelevant. I would say stung by a bee, but that's not irrelevant for everybody. But you're stung by a bee. It's not a big issue. It's a fairly irrelevant risk. There are risks which are problem risks, which you need to focus on. But then there are risks that are critical risks, and those are the ones that you need to, really be aware of. And around those, I would say you've got to be focused on doing the right thing, which may well be difficult and unpopular. So an example in our organization would be our FDA submission for our first product. We have had some delays, and I've had investors who, people who say, you're an incompetent management team because you've not yet done that process. But it is a critical process for us. And it would be remiss of me to do something quickly to satiate people's appetite or desires, rather than do the right thing, which actually might be a bit more difficult. Now, we are very much on the cusp of that process now, but, there's been some difficult decisions because that's a key matter for our business, a key risk. And I want to do it when we're ready to do it, rather than just do it because other people want us to do it.
That makes perfect sense. So don't be pressured. It's almost like peer pressure for a high school kid. Don't go do XYZ because all your peers are saying go do XYZ. Make sure you stand ground and do what you believe is right.
Exactly. Otherwise, you're one of those lemmings that jumps off a cliff with the rest of them, and suddenly, you're popular but dead.
Right. Okay. Next question for you. Timeless lessons you've learned along the way. You have an accounting background, medical background. You're running CEO of a company now. You're using AI to help people detect heart disease early. Very curious on where you want to go with this.
Okay. Well, I suspect this is very common on your show, but for a small pre-revenue company, rule number one, Adam, survive. That is rule number one. But life's not just simply about survival. So when I worked at Peel, when I was CEO at Peel, the found, which is kind of a $10 billion of asset company, one of the biggest private companies in the UK. The founder of that, he had a saying which was DPP, which meant determination, patience, and perseverance. And I think that those are incredibly important across the piece in business. Determination, patience, and perseverance. You have to keep going through adversity when everything looks like it's going wrong. That's not to be obstinate, but you've got to have those characteristics and those qualities to be able to survive, really. And then the second thing I would say would be, I think it's incredibly important to focus on substance over style. Can't tell you the number of times I've come across great people who maybe don't have the greatest style. People like good-looking people. People like articulate people who use the right buzzwords, who've got the right educational background. But actually, if you focus on the substance of people or a situation, it's far more important than the style of what's going on, which often turns people's heads and turns people's eyes. My next lesson would be, what do you focus on in life? And I think, there's a Venn diagram out there, which is what you can change and what's important. And you should only be focusing on what you can change and what's important, because if you can't change it, why are you worried about it or focused on it? If it's unimportant, why are you focused on it? So focus on those things, and you'll be a lot more successful. I sound a bit like a cliche, but my next one is, I always think about how do you make progress, and I liken it to climbing the stairs in your house, and which is you have to have an eye on where you're going, the destination, which is the next floor. But you have to get there by climbing one step at a time. So, you have to focus on the next step, but with an eye on where you're going. Because if you don't focus on what the next step is and you just focus on where you're going, you're not, it's pointless. My next one, which, a lot of people would say is obvious, but it is very, very true in my experience, is that great people make the difference. And I used to work when I worked at Speedy, the guy who employed me there, he basically had a philosophy, was just hire the best people you can, because the best people are the people that make a difference. We've all heard of the 80-20 rule, but it's usually the case that 20% of the people are making 80% of the difference. So hire the best people you can. And then finally, I'd say, you've really got to listen, and then you've got to learn and be prepared to adapt, because if you don't do those, you're not going anywhere.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. I love all of that, by the way. Very, very good. So next question for you, the flip side, timeless mistakes. Either you've seen other people make. How do you learn from them? Anywhere you want to go.
Okay. Well, there's another cliche, but it's true, which is, if you assume, you make an ass of you and me both.
Yes.
And I have found, the number of times people assume, I found myself doing this. You assume something's going to happen. You assume something will be. You assume people know something. And inevitably, that usually leads to problems. And then, the next timeless mistake or lesson I've learned from mistakes really is counting chickens. Start counting chickens before they've hatched. That is not a good thing. So don't get too far ahead of yourself, and do not count chickens. The number of times I've been a billionaire in my own head is ridiculous. I don't mean billionaire, but you know what I mean. It's important to keep your feet on the ground and focus on the now and what you can do now, rather than the future. And then the next thing I'd say is, because we can all fall foul of this, is don't focus on money. Don't, if you focus on financial success rather than what is actually needed within your business to succeed, then that will fail. You have to have a passion for what you're doing, and you have to have a focus on success, whether that's the product that you're making, being a leader in your industry, selling more product, leading a team better. If you focus just on, what can I make out of this, then that's not a good thing.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. Thank you for that. How about leadership? You're a CEO now. You've been in other businesses, big businesses, small businesses, successful ones. Where would you, what makes a great leader, and what are some lessons you've learned about leadership that you'd like to share with the audience?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, I'm kind of a bit older now, so I've kind of been through a few of these. But I actually think, first and foremost, you have to actually be self-aware and self-critical and honest about things, because the number of people who actually want to believe something is the case that isn't the case is amazing. And I don't know if you remember the fable of the Emperor's New Clothes, which is where the guy, the emperor gets sold that he's wearing the finest clothes by some tailors, but actually there's nothing there. and everybody's telling me it looks fantastic because they're scared of the emperor. But it takes a little boy to say, you're naked. And that's what you have to do every day. You have to be self-critical and self-aware. If you've made a mistake, be honest about it and move forward. Because the number of bosses who kind of see themselves as, invincible, I think is wrong. If you're not good at something, learn from it, move on. I mean, clearly, building a team is extremely important, and the ability to build a team. But that's what makes that possible. I think first of all, it's to acknowledge that not everybody in life is going to be a striker or a quarterback in American language. A good team is made up of, from the kicker, quarterback, defensive end. You need a blend of people, and you need a blend of roles. It's okay looking at the glory guys who will put the ball in the net, or quarterback who makes great plays, but that's not a team. The second thing is you have to value all of the people in your organization. Because it's easy to focus on the goal scorers, but you actually need to value everybody from, the cleaner up, frankly. I mean, we're a 12-person company now, but I worked in organizations that are thousands of people. And you need to value everybody. And then the other thing I'd say is your role is that of a coach. It is not your role to go on the pitch and run around and play everybody else's role for them. You have to coach. You have to be the coach. You have to organize. But it ain't your job to throw the ball or kick the ball. You have to trust the people that are there. And then I think also you have to lose the ego. If you have too many people believe in themselves that they're the boss, you're not the boss, you're a team member. And part of that means if you are saying something, you need to be prepared to explain yourself, and you need to have a good reason for doing things. It's not, I'm the boss, therefore we must do, or we'll do what I say. You need to have a good, rational, logical explanation. That doesn't mean to say that everybody's going to agree with you, but you need to be prepared to explain yourself. And also part of, not being the boss is don't expect people to do what you're not prepared to do. And I always prided myself on previous roles, as Speedy High, for example, you're talking about depots. Put the brush in your hand. Something needs cleaning up, pick it up off the floor. Don't expect other people to do that, and don't believe that things are below you or too little for you. And then in terms of, I think it's really important that you ask questions of people, and ask questions to listen and not simply to respond. And I know that that's a cliche in its own right, but it's really important that you actually listen to what people are trying to say, not simply to respond to them. I mean, clearly, I think, you need to be approachable and approachable to everybody. I always have my door open, and anybody in my organization is welcome to walk through the door. Everybody's welcome to talk to me. There's no, barriers, or, you can only come in if you've, made 16 appointments. There's none of that goes on. I think you need to be approachable. I think also in any organizations, you need to be able to paint a vision for people, because they have to have something to follow. People want something to follow. So if you, as the leader of that organization, are not able to articulate a vision for what you want to achieve as an organization, how's anybody else going to know where to go? And, the final thing I'd say is have fun and speak plainly. I can't stand people, I mean, we call it, or I call it, BS but bingo. People are walking to meetings and they're using all the kind of mumbo jumbo, like paradigm shift and strategic advantage and win-win and all these kind of things. Just speak plainly. You don't need to speak as if you're kind of trying to recite a business MBA book. And in terms of, having fun with people, serious matters don't need to be dealt with a dour face. You can have a sense of humor, and it makes life a lot easier. Imagine your marriage where you can't have a sense of humor. You've got to deal with everything in a kind of dour way. So, those are what I would say about from a leadership perspective.
Love that. How about for adversity? Being successful in life and in business requires overcoming adversity, interacting with adversity. How do you handle adversity, and what are some obstacles you had to overcome along the way?
Um, well, I think the first thing I never ever. Some people, their first reaction to things going wrong is who do I blame? Who's got this wrong? What? And I'm actually just not interested in that. Solution. What's the solution? How do we deal with this? How do we go forward from here? Because you can guarantee that things are going to go wrong at some point, and it's how do we solve this? How do we work together to solve that? Not who's made this happen. You've got to keep going. You've got to keep going when adversity strikes, because it is very easy to give in. And my experience of life is it's full of ups and downs. Just as you think that things are going fantastic and it's just going to be great forever, is usually where something comes and hits you in the side of the head, out of nowhere. And then just as you feel that life is, can't get worse, it starts to uptick. And I always think of the boat in a storm. If you're just pointing into the waves, you can bob up and down on them. If you try and stand against the waves, they'll run you over. So in life, when adversity strikes, you just got to kind of bob up and down a few times, and you've got to not try and stand against things, stand against the tide. And us as an organization, wow, we've had times where things were really critically difficult. Imagine you're short on funding, COVID hits, you're about to start clinical trials, nobody's allowed in hospitals, and we've had times where we're days away, when we were private, of running out of funding. And we just had to keep going. You just have to keep going sometimes.
Love it. So this way you're saying is when you have adversity, don't stop.
Don't
Keep going. Right.
Well, you keep going to the end. You just keep going to the end. I was think of the image of the diamond miner or the gold miner, and he's been mining away for years, and then he gives in, and he's that far from the diamond sea. You've just got to keep going to the end, and sometimes the end will arrive, but don't give in before you get there.
Got it. And then final question for you today. What is the best piece of advice you'd like to give the audience or your 30-year-old self?
Best be focus on your short game.
Like it.
Drive show, putt for dough. No, but on a serious thing, I mean, I've got a 30-year-old daughter, and she went to a good school, and talking about high school, and a lot of her peers were, their parents were, you're going to be a doctor, you're going to be an accountant, you're going to be a banker, you're going to be a lawyer, all of these kind of things. But I always said to her, and I say to other people, do what you enjoy and do what you have a passion for. Because if you've got a passion for something and you enjoy it, you've got half a chance that you'll be good at it. And if you're good at it, you'll be successful, no matter what that is. So do what you enjoy, not what not necessarily what you feel you should do. Number one. The second is, there are people, we all know people in life who suck energy away from us and people who give us energy. Avoid the former, surround yourself with the latter. It's so much easier. Life is so much easier when you're not having to kind of deal with people taking energy from you. I mean, life's kind of tough enough sometimes as it is. So focus on the latter. And then think, you do need to follow your gut. I mean, that doesn't mean make irrational decisions, but usually your gut gets it right. If your gut's telling you something, it's usually because that's the right thing to do. And then, my final one would be about relationships, really, because I think relationships are an important part of life, and people, it's easy in a business show to ignore that and say it's all, but it isn't. And I always liken a good relationship to tennis. So people say, find somebody that you've got some commonality in. Well, that could mean you're playing tennis with somebody, but if you're playing singles, you're actually playing against one another. So what you really need to do is find a doubles partner, which might mean that, you're good on the forehand, they're good on the backhand, but you're a good complementary team rather than necessarily doing the same thing, but being competitive or adversarial. So that's what I'd say to my 30-year-old self, and is what I've said to my 30-year-old daughter.
Love it. Well, Andrew, thank you so much for taking the time. All the best success. Hopefully, we'll have you on again soon.
Thanks, Adam. I really appreciate the invitation. And thank you for your time.